Barron Trump stepped into the cozy, family-owned restaurant, the warmth and the scent of freshly prepared food instantly welcoming him. The chatter of customers and clinking silverware filled the air, creating a comforting atmosphere. Barron sat at a table with a few friends, his usual quiet demeanor blending in with the background. But today, something felt different. As he glanced around, his eyes fell on the young waitress serving a table nearby. Her face, usually cheerful, now showed signs of distress. Barron noticed her shoulders were tense, her hands slightly shaking as she placed a drink on a customer's table. His eyes narrowed, sensing that something wasn't right. Across the room, a loud voice broke the moment of calm. A rude customer began berating the waitress, yelling at her over a minor mistake in his order. His harsh words cut through the noise of the restaurant, and diners started glancing at each other uneasily. The waitress stood frozen, her face reddening, trying to stay composed while the customer's insults piled up. Barron watched closely, his heart sinking as the waitress fought to hold back tears. She was clearly hurting, and the customer's cruelty only deepened her discomfort. Everyone seemed to be avoiding the confrontation, too afraid to intervene. But Barron couldn't remain silent any longer. As the tension reached its peak, he stood up. What happens next will leave you speechless. The atmosphere in the restaurant grew heavy as Barron stood up. His eyes locked on the rude customer across the room. His heart beat steadily, but his mind was clear. This wasn't just about a moment of anger. This was about doing what was right. The waitress, still standing frozen in the midst of the storm, didn't notice Barron moving toward her. Her focus was entirely on the customer, trying to endure his insults with as much dignity as she could muster. The customer, oblivious to Barron's approach, continued his tirade. "What's wrong with you? Can't even get a simple order right?" His voice was loud, his words dripping with entitlement. The restaurant had gone eerily quiet, but the tension was palpable. Everyone was waiting for the inevitable eruption, but no one was stepping in. The waitress, now visibly shaking, stood there, trapped between the words and the crowd. Barron reached the table, his steps calm but purposeful. His presence cut through the noise, drawing the eyes of every person in the room. The customer paused, his attention shifting. Barron's face was calm, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes, something that made the situation shift in that instant. "You've crossed the line," Barron said, his voice steady and firm, not a hint of aggression. The customer, taken aback by Barron's sudden confrontation, let out a sharp laugh. "What's this? Some rich kid coming to play hero?" He sneered, his tone mocking. "You think you can teach me a lesson?" Barron didn't flinch. He stood tall, his voice unwavering as he looked directly at the customer. "You don't have to tear someone down to feel better about yourself," he said. His words hung in the air, and for a split second, everything was still. The room was silent, the weight of Barron's calm words settling in. The rude customer, now caught off guard, was left speechless. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Barron's quiet but powerful response had completely disarmed him. All the bravado the man had carried into the room vanished in an instant. The waitress, watching from behind the counter, couldn't believe what she was seeing. For the first time, her fear began to melt away, replaced by a sense of something she hadn't felt in a long time: respect. She glanced up at Barron, her eyes wide with disbelief, unsure if this was really happening. The shift in the room was unmistakable. The power had just shifted, and it wasn't in the bully's favor anymore. Barron's calm, measured defense had given her something more than just protection. It had given her a reason to believe in kindness again. After standing up to the rude customer, Barron returned to his table, his mind still replaying the scene. He wasn't used to standing up to people like that, not in front of others, not in a public place, but today, something about it felt right. He could still hear the words echoing in his head, but more than anything, he kept thinking about the waitress's face, the way she had stood there, vulnerable and afraid. But then, in that moment of silence, something had changed. The restaurant had resumed its rhythm, but the air felt lighter now, like something had shifted. Barron tried to focus on his meal, but his eyes kept glancing toward the waitress. She was back behind the counter, her movements stiff, as if she was trying to return to her routine. He noticed her glance toward him and then quickly look away, unsure of what to do. Minutes later, she approached Barron's table to take their empty plates, still visibly shaken, her hands slightly trembling. She moved with the caution of someone unsure whether to thank him or to simply pretend nothing had happened. Barron looked up, meeting her gaze. His eyes softened, and without thinking, he offered a small, sincere smile, a gesture that felt almost instinctual. "Thank you for your service," Barron said quietly, his voice warm, not out of obligation, but because he meant it. The waitress hesitated, her hands pausing in midair as she stared at him, taken aback by the kindness in his tone. Something in her expression shifted, as if she were seeing Barron for the first time, not as a privileged figure, but as someone who saw her for who she was. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and then, unexpectedly, the waitress's eyes welled up with tears. She quickly blinked them away, but they were still there, threatening to spill over. Her voice wavered as she spoke, barely above a whisper. "I've been working so many jobs just to make ends meet," she confessed, her hands tightening around the tray in front of her. "And every day, it feels like nobody sees me, like I'm just invisible." Barron leaned in slightly, his gaze soft but firm, listening intently. His heart tightened with an ache he hadn't expected. "You are seen," he said gently. "You matter. How people treat others reflects who they are, not who you are." His words hung in the air between them, his sincerity echoing in the quiet space. The waitress looked at him, her face filled with a mixture of disbelief and relief. For the first time, someone had acknowledged her pain, not with pity, but with respect. Her shoulders relaxed and a flicker of something brighter, hope, perhaps, began to shine in her eyes. She nodded, a tear escaping despite her efforts to keep it at bay. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky but filled with gratitude. Barron gave her a soft, reassuring smile, understanding the weight of that simple exchange. The tension that had once hung thick in the air began to lift, slowly but surely, as Barron's quiet words continued to resonate throughout the restaurant. Whispers started to ripple through the room, reaching the ears of the other diners. A few of them, initially silent observers, now found the courage to stand up. One by one, they began to approach Barron's table, offering quiet nods of approval and soft murmurs of gratitude. "I've never seen anyone stand up like that before," one older gentleman said, his voice full of respect. "It takes real courage to do what you did. She didn't deserve that." Another customer, a middle-aged woman, added with a smile, "Thank you for doing the right thing. It's not often you see people stand up for others these days." Barron nodded, his face calm but filled with a quiet pride. He wasn't used to being praised, and it wasn't about the recognition. It was about the simple act of doing what he knew was right. As more people gathered around him, sharing their appreciation, the entire atmosphere of the restaurant shifted. The rude customer, now looking humiliated and defeated, stood up from his seat, his shoulders slumped. He muttered something under his breath, clearly trying to salvage what was left of his pride, but the weight of his words had already been exposed. He made a beeline for the exit, but as he passed, a few others raised their voices, speaking up about his earlier behavior. "Hey, no one treats people like that," one of the diners called out, her voice filled with a sudden burst of confidence. "You don't get to speak to anyone that way." A few others nodded in agreement, and the energy in the room shifted from tension to empowerment. The room had quietly turned on the rude customer, and he was forced to leave, his head down, as he shuffled out of the door, the whispers following him like an echo. The waitress, standing at the far end of the room, watched the entire exchange unfold. Her hands, once trembling, now rested at her sides as she took in the change around her. The room, once cold and filled with judgment, now felt warm and filled with camaraderie. Barron's quiet, unassuming act of standing up for her had ignited something far greater than a single moment. It had sparked a ripple effect that spread throughout the entire restaurant. As she moved closer to Barron's table, she couldn't stop the tears that welled up in her eyes. They weren't tears of sadness, but of something deeper: gratitude, relief, and awe. She had spent so many days feeling invisible, as if no one cared, but Barron had shown her something different. He had given her more than a simple defense. He had validated her worth in front of a room full of strangers. Barron noticed the tears in her eyes and, with a gentle smile, offered her a kind word. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "Just keep being you. You're worth so much more than what anyone says." His words were simple, but they held an undeniable truth. The waitress, overwhelmed, simply nodded, the warmth of Barron's kindness wrapping around her like a soft blanket. In that moment, it was clear. Barron's quiet strength had transformed not just one life, but an entire room. As the evening wore on, the restaurant's atmosphere had transformed entirely. What was once thick with discomfort and silence now hummed with a new energy. The tension that had weighed heavily on the room earlier had vanished, replaced by a warmth that seemed to spread through every corner. The sound of laughter returned, soft and genuine, as the diners carried on with their meals. It was as if Barron's quiet act of bravery had lifted the weight from the restaurant's shoulders, making everyone feel a little lighter, a little more connected. The waitress, who had once stood frozen, her hands trembling under the weight of cruel words, now moved through the room with newfound confidence. Her posture had straightened, her movements more assured. The fear in her eyes had been replaced with a quiet strength, a strength that hadn't been there just hours before. As she served her tables, her smile was no longer a forced gesture. It was real, born from a sense of pride in herself, in the dignity that had been restored through a simple act of kindness. Barron, finishing his meal, stood up to leave, his movements slow and deliberate. But as he walked toward the door, his eyes caught the waitress's once more. There was a brief moment where their gazes met, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He could see the change in her, the way she had reclaimed a piece of herself, and it moved him more than he could have anticipated. With a quiet step, Barron walked over to her station, where she was still tidying up a nearby table. She looked up, surprised, not quite sure what to expect. Barron smiled gently, his voice low and kind. "What's your name?" he asked, his words soft yet filled with sincerity. The waitress blinked, caught off guard by the question. She hesitated for a moment, almost unsure of how to respond. "It's Emily," she said, her voice tinged with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. Barron nodded, his eyes softening. "I just wanted to say thank you, not just for your service but for the strength you showed today. It takes a lot to keep going, especially in tough situations. You've got more strength than you realize." And with that, Barron placed a generous tip on the counter, his actions quiet but powerful. "This is for you," he said, his smile warm and genuine. "You're worth far more than this, but it's a small token of my appreciation." Emily stood there, stunned. No one had ever treated her like this before. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked at the tip, her eyes widening in disbelief. This wasn't just a generous gesture, it was an affirmation of her worth, of the dignity she had so long been denied. She wasn't just a waitress, a nameless face serving food to strangers. In Barron's eyes, she was someone deserving of respect, of kindness, of recognition. A rush of emotion surged within Emily. She felt something shift inside her, a deep, healing warmth. For the first time, she truly felt seen. As Barron made his way to the door, the restaurant, once filled with the echoes of harsh words, now seemed quieter, peaceful even. Emily stood behind the counter, her hands still slightly trembling, but her heart no longer heavy with the weight of those cruel words. It was as if a shift had occurred, something deep and powerful that had changed her, even if just for this moment. The air felt lighter, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of quiet pride. Barron reached for the door, his fingers brushing the handle, and for a moment, everything around him seemed to slow. He turned his head, his eyes meeting hers across the room. Their gaze locked, just a brief second, but it carried so much unspoken understanding. It wasn't just about the tip or his words. It was about what those actions had ignited in her. Emily felt her chest tighten as if something inside her was being unlocked, something that had been dormant for far too long, a belief in her own worth. The silence between them spoke volumes. Barron's eyes, calm yet full of meaning, communicated a message far deeper than any words could. It was a recognition of her humanity, a validation she hadn't realized she needed until now. She wasn't just the person who brought food to the table, who smiled through exhaustion. She was seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long while. Barron's quiet strength had lifted her, showing her a kindness that cut through the noise of her daily struggles. Emily blinked, surprised at the sudden rush of tears that threatened to spill over. She quickly wiped them away, not wanting to show her vulnerability, yet something inside her broke free. It wasn't sadness. It was a mixture of gratitude, relief, and the overwhelming weight of knowing that her life had been touched by something far bigger than herself. Barron smiled softly, offering a brief nod. Then, without a word, he stepped out of the door, leaving the restaurant behind him. The door closed quietly, and as it did, a wave of silence enveloped the room. Emily stood there, her heart racing, the emotions of the day finally catching up with her. A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time, it wasn't born from hurt or humiliation. It was from something much deeper, hope. As the restaurant's light dimmed behind her, she felt the quiet strength Barron had shown her settle into her own soul. She wasn't alone, and for the first time in a long time, she believed that no matter what life threw at her, she deserved to be treated with kindness, respect, and dignity. Barron had reminded her of that, and now she would carry that lesson with her. The night had ended, and the restaurant returned to its usual rhythm, but something had changed, something deep and invisible, yet undeniable. Barron's simple act of kindness didn't just stay within the walls of the restaurant. Word spread quickly, fueled by the patrons who witnessed it. What had started as a quiet defense against cruelty had blossomed into a broader conversation about the power of empathy, respect, and standing up for others. Social media buzzed with posts, shares, and tweets about Barron's actions. Influencers, news outlets, and local organizations began taking note, all echoing the same message: kindness matters. At first, Emily, the waitress, couldn't quite comprehend the weight of what had happened, but soon it became clear. People were talking about the quiet strength she'd been shown, how Barron's calm and unwavering support had made all the difference. Her story was shared over and over again. What had been a single moment of vulnerability had now sparked a movement. Emily, once someone who had quietly accepted her mistreatment, began to find her voice. She was no longer afraid to stand up for herself. Her confidence grew as she shared the story with her coworkers, her friends, even her family. "I never thought something so small could change everything," she said to her sister, a smile finally breaking through the years of doubt. "But now I know that kindness is more than just a moment. It's a choice. It's a way of life." The ripple of Barron's gesture had reached places Emily never imagined. She had gone from being the one who endured in silence to becoming an advocate for kindness. Emily began to stand taller, speaking out when she saw others mistreated, helping others find their voice too. The power of one person's action had sparked a fire within her, reminding her that her voice mattered, that she deserved to be seen, heard, and respected. Meanwhile, Barron went on with his life, unaware of the true extent of his impact. For him, the act had simply been about doing what was right in that moment, standing up for someone who needed it. But for Emily, that single moment had changed her life, permanently altering the course of her future. It wasn't just the tip, or the words of encouragement, or even the action that had mattered. It was the reminder that kindness isn't a fleeting gesture. It's a spark that can ignite something far greater. A small act of courage, once shared, ripples outward, touching lives in ways we may never fully understand. That night, Barron had done more than just defend a waitress. He had started a movement, and for Emily, it would forever serve as a reminder that kindness is powerful enough to change the world, one small act at a time. If this story inspired you, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who needs a reminder of the power of kindness. Let's create a ripple effect of compassion, one small act at a time. Stand up for others, lift someone's spirit, and remember that every kind gesture can make a world of difference. Be the change you want to see in the world.